There are moments when life seems to stop. Prayers go up, but the sky remains closed. Time passes, the signs don't come, and the soul begins to wonder if God is still listening. It's a type of silence that hurts. Not because he's absent, but because we don't understand the language of silence. The psalmist went through this when he wrote, "How long, Lord? Will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me?" Psalms chapter 13, verse 1. This verse isn't despair, it's humanity. It shows that even men of faith go through seasons where God seems distant, where prayer echoes and returns unanswered, and where faith is tested not by the storm, but by the absence of wind. God's silence isn't rejection, it's a test, and every test has a purpose. What we call delay, God calls process. And it's in this process that he separates childish faith from mature faith, because believing when everything makes sense is natural. Believing when nothing makes sense is divine. Spiritual trials don't come to humiliate us, but to reveal us. God doesn't test to know who we are, he tests to show us who we've become. The confusion, the waiting, the discomfort, and the loneliness, it's all part of the laboratory where spiritual character is refined. Just as gold is tested by fire, faith is tested by silence. There is no other way. Many give up at this point, believing that God has forgotten them. But it's precisely in this interval that he's closest, only working in silence, because there are lessons that can only be taught when the noise of the soul ceases. And the greatest of these is this: faith isn't measured by how much we hear God, but by how much we continue when we hear nothing. That's what this video is about. Today, we're going to go through the 5 levels of divine testing, the spiritual stages the soul goes through when the sky seems silent. You'll understand what it means when the answers don't come, when the path narrows, and when everything seems stopped. But in reality, God is still guiding, only in a different way. Before we start, write in the comments where you're watching this video from. I want to know how far this message is reaching. And if you feel like you're going through a time when God seems distant, subscribe to the channel, because in the coming weeks, we're going to continue talking about what no one has the courage to say, the hidden purpose in the delays of heaven. Now take a deep breath and prepare to understand the first level of divine testing, the most confusing, the most human, and the most necessary: confusion. Level 1, confusion. Every divine test begins with the collapse of logic. Suddenly, what made sense before no longer does. The plans that seemed certain fall apart, the doors that were open close, and the heart, which was once filled with faith, is now filled with questions. There is no voice, no sign, no answer. There is only the echo of doubt within the soul. And in this emptiness, man begins to wonder, where is God? Confusion is the first stage of the test, the point at which God ceases to be predictable. The sky seems silent, but it isn't. Silence is just the new language the Spirit has chosen to speak. Only man, accustomed to hearing through emotion, doesn't recognize the sound of faith maturing. He confuses absence with abandonment, when in reality, it's just the beginning of spiritual training. In Job, chapter 23, verses 8 and 9, the righteous man vents, "Behold, I go forward, but he is not there, and backward, but I cannot perceive him. On the left hand where he is working, I cannot behold him. He turns to the right hand, and I cannot see him." Job didn't lose faith, he lost his reference point, and that's what confusion does. It doesn't destroy faith, it disorganizes perception. Man no longer knows where God is, but still seeks him. And this act of continuing to seek, even without understanding, is the first step of true faith. Think of someone who prayed for something for months, and everything seemed to get worse. He believed he was doing everything right, attending church, helping people, keeping his heart pure, and yet life closed in. At this point, the question that no one likes to ask arises: if God is just, why is this happening to me? And it's precisely this question that separates those who believe out of habit from those who believe out of conviction. Genuine faith isn't built on answers, but on resistance to mystery. Confusion is the storm where God silences the noise of our certainty. He dismantles explanations, overturns the table of predictability, and invites us to see beyond what the eyes understand. It's painful because man wants order, but the divine process before building needs to deconstruct. God doesn't want understanding that accommodates. He wants understanding that transforms. And for that, sometimes he needs to allow everything to seem meaningless. When God is silent, he isn't far away. He's teaching the invisible. The test begins precisely when logic ends. And the first test isn't to endure the pain, but to endure the confusion. The mind tries to decipher, the heart tries to understand, but only the spirit understands what's happening. The purpose of confusion is to break the dependence on human understanding, because true faith doesn't flourish in answers, it flourishes in uncertainties. And there's something subtle in this stage. Man still speaks, still prays, still seeks, but feels that the words hit the ceiling. The sky seems to be made of stone, and the soul of glass. But it's in this friction that the spirit begins to mature, because God can only reveal himself in a profound way when man unlearns the shallow ways of believing. Have you ever lived through a time when everything seemed meaningless, but something inside you told you not to give up? Then perhaps you've already entered the first phase of divine testing. Confusion is the desert before direction, and whoever resists it discovers the secret of the next level, when the heart speaks louder than faith and man begins to murmur. Level 2. Complaining. Confusion opens the door to the test, but it's in complaining that it actually begins, because when man stops understanding, he begins to feel, and feeling without understanding is the fertile ground of murmuring. The soul gets tired of waiting, the mind revolts, and the heart, once humble, begins to question, why me? What did I do wrong? How long will this last? These questions aren't sin, they're human, but when repeated without faith, they become the noise that prevents the spirit from hearing the answer. Murmuring is man's attempt to fill God's silence with his own voice, and the more he speaks, the less he hears. Faith at this point is confused with venting, and venting becomes complaining. Complaining is born from legitimate pain, but grows in the absence of trust. Because when the heart speaks louder than faith, the sound of faith is lost. The people of Israel lived through this stage during the desert, freed from Egypt, but still captive inside. God guided them by day with a cloud and by night with a pillar of fire, and yet they murmured. Not because they didn't see God's power, but because they didn't accept the process. They wanted the destination, not the desert, the promise, not the test. And that's precisely what murmuring reveals, the distance between what man desires and what God wants to teach. Think of someone who prayed for years for an answer, and all they received was silence. Each day, the heart fills a little more with frustration. The words that were once of faith now come out bitter, heavy. The mind begins to compare. Why did the other person succeed? Why is it always harder for me? But comparison is the poison of faith, because whoever compares forgets that God doesn't repeat lessons. He personalizes tests. Each person's dessert has its own address and only ends when the purpose is learned. Complaining is dangerous because it transforms pain into an argument. Man begins to use suffering as a justification for doubting. And the more he speaks, the more he distances himself from trust. Faith withers not for lack of prayer, but for excess of self-pity. The voice that once said, God will provide, now murmurs, God has forgotten me. And it's in this subtle inversion that the enemy infiltrates. But God isn't offended by sincere lament. He's saddened by the ungrateful heart. There's a difference between venting and complaining. Venting still seeks God. Complaining accuses him. And when man begins to blame heaven for not acting, the test changes phase. Because the purpose of the test isn't to break man, but to break the pride that prevents man from trusting. The book of Exodus, chapter 16, shows what happens when murmuring dominates. The people complained about the lack of bread, and God sent manna. But the manna wasn't an answer. It was a lesson. It fell every morning, never in excess, to teach that God's provision isn't a stock, it's daily dependence. Whoever trusts waits. Whoever complains accumulates fear. There are moments when complaining is the last barrier between the soul and obedience. Because right after it, man has two choices: either continue murmuring and get lost, or be silent and learn to resist. And it's precisely at this point in the silence after venting that the third level of divine testing begins. Level 3. Resistance. Confusion shook the mind. Complaining wore out the heart. Now comes the longest and most decisive stage, that of resistance. It's here that man learns to remain, even without feeling anything. The sky remains silent, the answers remain distant, but something new is born within him. The faith that doesn't depend on emotion. Resistance is the point at which the relationship with God ceases to be based on exchanges and becomes based on fidelity. Man no longer seeks to feel, seeks to be faithful. He prays even without encouragement, gives thanks even without understanding, continues even tired. Faith at this level ceases to be shine and becomes root. It doesn't enchant, it sustains. And that's why this stage is so valuable in God's eyes and so painful for those who go through it. The soul cries out for signs, but God remains quiet, not because he's absent, but because he's teaching something that the noise of the answers wouldn't let you learn. Silence is the weight used by heaven to strengthen the column of faith. Just as the body only grows under resistance, the soul only matures under waiting. Absence is the exercise of trust. Think of someone who continues to attend church even feeling empty, who reads the Bible without feeling emotion, but still reads it, who continues to pray even when the prayer seems not to pass the ceiling. This is the portrait of mature faith. The faith that doesn't need applause from heaven, only the certainty that he's still there, even quiet. The true believer isn't the one who feels God. It's the one who remains when he feels nothing. The prophet Habakkuk understood this when he declared, "Though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fails and the fields produce no food, yet I will rejoice in the Lord." Habakkuk chapter 3, verses 17 and 18. This is the essence of resistance, to remain even when nothing flourishes. The test isn't the desert, it's the time that man manages to continue walking in it. During resistance, faith ceases to be feeling and becomes decision. The soul matures because it learns to obey not out of emotion but out of loyalty. Man stops asking why and starts saying, "Even so." And it's in this "even so" that hell loses strength. Because the enemy knows he can take away the comfort, but he can't take away the conviction. Resistance has no beauty. It has purpose. It's the stage in which God doesn't change the circumstances, but changes the man within them. The exterior remains the same, but the interior will never be the same again. God uses time as a sculptor of the soul, and each day without an answer is another blow of the divine chisel, shaping the invisible character of faith. Perhaps this is the loneliest stage of the journey. People don't understand, the advice sounds empty, and even hope seems like repetition. But it's precisely here that faith turns into rock. Because the man who survives this silence is never again shaken by the noise of the world. He discovers that the true miracle isn't being delivered from the test. It's remaining within it without losing faith. How many days have you resisted even without feeling anything? Perhaps God is silent, not because he's forgotten you, but because he's strengthening you. And when the heart matures enough to remain, the test changes shape, and the fourth level is born: obedience. Level 4, obedience. After resisting, man finally understands. God doesn't need to explain, only to be obeyed. What was once a struggle transforms into surrender. There's no longer a need to understand the why of things, because the heart has learned something greater than understanding: trust. Obedience is the point at which the relationship with God ceases to be childish. It's the moment when man matures spiritually and realizes that faith isn't feeling, it's following. He no longer asks, "Lord, how long?" Now he says, "Lord, even so." It's here that the servant becomes a son and the follower becomes a disciple. Obeying when everything is going well is easy, but obeying when nothing makes sense is the apex of faith. Because in this stage, man learns that God's purpose isn't explainable, it's livable. And only those who obey discover what logic would never understand. The mind wants answers, the soul wants instructions, and obedience is the answer that heaven expects to hear, even when the heart is still full of questions. The deepest example of this level is Abraham. God didn't ask him to understand, only to climb the mountain. He didn't explain the reason, didn't reveal the outcome, only ordered, "Go." And Abraham went. Each step was a conflict between reason and faith, between pain and trust, between fatherhood and obedience. But at the moment he raised the cleaver, God revealed what he always wanted, not the sacrifice, but the willingness to obey. The lamb was ready all the time. Abraham just needed to get to the end of the instruction. And it's like that with all of us. Provision never fails. It only awaits the moment when faith proves that it's ready. Obedience is the quietest stage and paradoxically the most audible, because at this point, God no longer needs to speak. Man already knows what he needs to do. There's no longer a need for confirmations, because faith has already understood the tone of the divine voice. The soul comes into tune with the purpose, and the heart, which once doubted, now rests. It's in this rest that true spiritual peace is born, not from the absence of tests, but from the presence of surrender. Obeying is the purest gesture of faith, because it requires two deaths, that of the will and that of control. God doesn't test to measure how much we endure, but to reveal how far we trust. And that's why obedience is the highest point of the test, because it's in it that man decides to continue even without knowing the destination. Faith becomes adult when it understands that walking with God is walking without a map, but with certainty. Think of how many times you've wanted to understand before obeying, and by hesitating, you lost the blessing that would only come after the step. God rarely shows the entire path because he wants us to learn to walk one step at a time. His light never illuminates the whole road, only the next meter. Whoever obeys, walks. Whoever waits to understand, stands still. It's at this point that the soul learns the true meaning of divine silence. God doesn't explain because obedience is the explanation. And when man finally accepts this, something changes in the invisible. The test doesn't end, but the purpose is revealed. And it's at this moment that the last level begins. Revelation. Level 5. Revelation. Revelation doesn't happen when the test ends. It happens when the heart matures enough to understand the silence. God never stopped speaking. It was man who needed to learn to listen. The sky didn't go mute, it just waited for the moment when the noise of anxiety ceased so that the gentle voice could be heard. The divine test always ends in the same place where it began, but the man who comes out of it is no longer the same who entered. Revelation is the confirmation that everything had a purpose. Confusion taught humility, complaining revealed pride, resistance forged character. Obedience generated maturity, and now revelation is born as a natural fruit of inner transformation. God doesn't change the circumstances, he changes the consciousness. What was pain now seems like training. What was delay now sounds like precision. What seemed like abandonment now reveals itself as silent presence. When heaven speaks again, he doesn't bring new answers. He shows that the answers were hidden in the questions themselves. Man realizes that each delay was protection, each loss was polishing, each silence was disguised direction, and understands that, during all the time, God was never silent. He was whispering through time. Moses lived this in the desert. For 40 years, he felt forgotten, exiled, erased. But it was in this time of oblivion that he learned to hear God not in thunder, but in the murmur of the wind. The same rock that one day he struck out of despair would later be the symbol of divine fidelity. Because God doesn't waste any desert, he recycles each silence into wisdom. Think of the gold that goes through the fire. During heating, it melts, mixes, seems to lose shape. But in reality, it's being purified. The temperature didn't come to destroy it, but to separate what is impure. So also is the divine test. The fire of silence didn't come to burn you, it came to refine you. And revelation is the shine that emerges when the gold finally stops resisting the heat. At this level, man realizes that the answer he expected from outside was always being built from within. He understands that the voice of God never disappeared. It just changed tone. Sometimes God speaks through words, other times through absence. But he always speaks. The secret is to be sensitive enough to recognize when heaven changes language. And finally, the soul rests. Not because life has become easy, but because it understood. The heart, which once cried out for explanations, now gives thanks for the process. The prayer changes. It ceases to be, "Lord, take me out of this," and becomes, "Lord, teach me with this." This is the sign that the test has ended, when pain transforms into understanding and silence into communion. God didn't silence. He matured you. And the man who goes through all the levels of divine testing discovers something that the world will never understand. That God's silence isn't absence, it's presence in teaching mode. The divine test is, above all, an invitation, not to understand God, but to hear him in another way. Because heaven speaks in many languages, and the deepest of them is silence. God doesn't shout to those who seek him. He whispers to those who remain. And it's in this whisper that the heart finally understands what haste would never understand. The journey of the soul goes through 5 levels: confusion, complaining, resistance, obedience, and revelation. 5 steps that weren't made to test strength, but to reveal faith. Confusion showed that the mind doesn't govern the spirit. Complaining exposed the hidden pride. Resistance taught that faith is decision, not sensation. Obedience proved that God doesn't want understanding, he wants trust. And revelation crowned all this, showing that his silence was always a disguised answer. How many times have you thought that God had moved away, when, in reality, he just hid within the process? How many tears did you think were losses, but in reality were baptisms of maturity? The divine test isn't punishment, it's polishing. Gold doesn't complain about the fire, it only shines after it. And it's like that with the soul. It only reveals what it has of eternal when it goes through the heat of delay. God knows what he does with time. He's never early, he's never late. He's teaching while he seems to silence. And when man finally stops seeking signs and learns to hear the silence, he discovers that heaven never stopped speaking. He was just talking too much to listen. Therefore, if you're going through a time of silence, don't run away. Don't try to rush the process. Don't exchange the desert for distraction. What seems like absence now is the womb of revelation. And when the purpose is born, you'll understand that each tear was watering for a deeper faith. Before closing, write in the comments where you're watching this video from. I want to know how far this message is reaching. And even more, I want the world to see that there are people like you who continue to believe even when the sky goes silent. And if this message spoke to you, subscribe to the channel, Every week we'll bring reflections like this to remember that God still works in silence and that silence is also a form of love. Because in the end, the divine test isn't about how much God speaks. It's about how much man has learned to listen without sound.